Welcome to the Spotlight on Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2021, which we refer to as CRRSAA, funding for 5310 sub-recipients and tribes. My name is Carrie Diamond, and I'm with the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center. Who's joining us today? So about half of the registered folks on this webinar are sub-recipients. We had 7 tribal recipients register, about 84 direct and designated recipients, 50 who are not recipients of 5310, and 3 indicated that they are interested in applying for 5310 funding. So a few instructions before we get started. First of all, everybody is on mute. If you'd like to communicate with the hosts, please do so in the chat box. Questions will be answered at the end, and we request that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen rather than chat to put your questions in. Because when questions are put in chat, they scroll up and sometimes are missed, but with the Q&A function, that's specifically designed only for questions, and we will take them from there. And you're welcome to do that throughout the whole presentation. This webinar is being recorded. There is an option for live captions at the bottom of your screen. In the chat box, I have put the link if you would like to see the live transcript through stream text. Again, asking questions should be through the Q&A box, and there is a small icon showing what the Q&A function looks like. And just a note that this webinar is for informational purposes. Press inquiries should be directed to the FTA press office directly. Before we get started, I want to tell a little bit about the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center. We are a FTA-funded technical assistance center that is operated and administered by a partnership among the National Association of Area Agencies on Aging, or N4A, and Easter Seals, Inc. This center was launched in 2015 with the purpose to promote the availability and accessibility of transportation options that serve the needs of older adults, people with disabilities, and their caregivers. One of our focuses is specifically on the Section 5310 formula grant. And our objectives include providing person-centered technical assistance, information and resources, training, communication and outreach, coordination and partnership, and investment in community solutions. For more information, please see www.nadtc.org. So it is my pleasure today to welcome from the Federal Transit Administration, Marianne Stocks, who is the Division Chief for the Rural and Targeted Programs, and Destiny Buchanan, Acting 5310 Program Manager. Go ahead and share your screen, Destiny. And just a reminder that if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box going forward.
Good afternoon and welcome again to the NADTC 5310 Coronavirus Response Relief Supplemental Appropriate Act of 2021. My name is Destiny Buchanan and I am the Acting 5310 Program Manager. Today I'm here with my supervisor, Marianne Stocks, and we're going to be going over 5310 CRRSAA funds. I would like to begin by stating that this webinar does not have the force and effect of law and is not meant to bind the public in any way. The webinar is intended only to provide clarity to the public regarding existing requirements under the law or agency policies. Grantees and sub-grantees should refer to FTA statutes and regulations for applicable requirements. Since the beginning of COVID-19, FTA has allocated $25 billion in CARES Act funds to help transit providers. We have used our emergency relief program to allow the urban area and rural area formulas to be used at 100% federal share for COVID-19 related expenses, as well as operating expenses for the large urban recipients. We have provided administrative relief to transit providers by extending the deadlines for competitive grant applications, as well as the due dates for the grant reporting. We've postponed oversight reviews as well as the National Transit Database reporting requirements. We distributed more than 14 million cloth face coverings to 2,200 transit systems and have issued a safety advisory, which has recommended actions to reduce the risk of COVID-19 among transit employees as well as passengers. Crisa provided $14 billion to support the transit industry in response to COVID-19. Of those funds, $13.26 billion was allocated to the Urbanized Area Formula Program. $678 million was allocated to the Formula Grants for Rural Area Program, and that included $30 million that was set aside for tribal formula. $10 million was allocated for administration and oversight, and $50 million was allocated for the enhanced mobility of seniors and individuals with disabilities. And I can proudly say that we have at least one obligation for 5310 Crisa funds, and that was to the Stark Area Regional Transit Authority in Ohio. Crisa, unlike CARES Act, did not provide funds for the 5310 recipients, but it does emphasize that funding is made available for payroll and operations of public transportation. All projects that are funded under Crisa are available at 100% federal share and also have pre-award authority that begins on January 20th, 2020. These funds are available until they are expended and have no lapse dates. Recipients are encouraged to use the funds quickly for operating and payroll expenses. Any entity that is eligible for a 5310 program is also eligible for 5310 Crisa funds. That includes entities that have not received 5310 funds in the past, and people who are eligible usually are states and local government authorities, designated recipients, private nonprofit organizations, tribes, and operators of public transportation. I will now give it over to Marianne Stocks to explain further.
Thank you, Destiny. My name, again, is Marianne Stock, and I'm the Chief of Rural and Targeted Programs at the FTA. So I'm going to start by getting into some of the details about how the funds are apportioned. So the apportionments under the 5310 section of Crisa have been posted for large urbanized areas, small urbanized areas, and rural areas. It's posted on the FTA website. Similar to the annual section 5310 apportionments, the apportionments are listed by state and by designated recipient, and the state or designated recipient for each area will determine the allocation to subrecipients. Next slide. Recipients that are in shared UZAs are encouraged to coordinate with the designated recipient to obtain their allocation. And if applicable, a split letter would need to be provided to FTA. Subrecipients also need to coordinate with or wait for direction from the FTA recipient regarding their allocation. Eligible expenses. So the same types of activities that are eligible under section 5310 are eligible for funding under Crisa. However, Congress made it clear that to the maximum extent possible, funding should be directed to payroll and operations of public transit, and that can include payroll expenses of private operators such as service contractors that are providing public transportation. Capital expenses such as vehicle purchases are only allowable if the recipient certifies to FTA that the recipient has not furloughed any employees. Next slide. Operating expenses for all recipients are eligible beginning January 20th, 2020. And if you were on our webinar on Tuesday, there was an error. This is the correct date. So examples of operating expenses include administrative leave of operations personnel, due to reductions in service, or if they were quarantined and they were put on leave, vehicle operator salaries, fuel, any items with a useful life of less than 1 year, and personal protective equipment such as masks or anything in that area that has a useful life of less than 1 year. The requirement to use 55% of funds for traditional capital projects does not apply to CRRSAA funds. But one of the unique provisions of CRRSAA is that it permits previously appropriated but unobligated 5310 funds to be awarded at 100% federal match. And that what that means is that if there was 5310 funding that is not yet in an FTA grant, that's what unobligated means, then it could be awarded at 100% match. However, the non-CRRSAA funding must still meet the 55% requirement, that 55% be used for traditional capital projects, and it must be included in a coordinated plan. So all federal transit program requirements, the regular requirements apply to CRRSAA funding. That means, as I referenced earlier, new split letters are required if they're applicable in your area. There are a couple of exceptions to this, all federal program requirements. Some of the expenses do not need to be in a TIP, STIP, or a long-range transportation plan. Those include operating expenses and capital expenses that do not involve a substantial change to the location, function, or capacity of an asset. So just as with regular Section 5310 funding, the Coordinated Human Services Transportation Plan requirement applies to CRRSAA funds. That means that the Section 5310 activities funded through CRRSAA must be part of a locally developed Coordinated Human Services Transportation Plan. States and designated recipients have the flexibility to allocate CRRSAA funding through a different process than the one described in a previously approved state management plan without prior FTA approval, but they should document any deviations from their previously approved plan in an attachment to the CRRSAA funding application. An example of the kind of deviation that I might be talking about would be from the previous plan, would be in order to give priority to operating funding as CRRSAA requires. That's a very specific change. If the existing state management plan doesn't allow for that, obviously you can still do it with CRRSAA funds, but you should just document what it is that you're doing that's different. Next slide. So I'm not going to dwell on this, but this is here for the information of anybody who needs to be knowing about the coding in the TRAMS, in FTA's grant management system. If you're a direct recipient constructing a grant for CRRSAA funds, you'll need this information. Most important thing is that CRRSAA grants should not be combined with any other funding sources, and you can just work with your FTA regional office on any other questions regarding the actual construction of a grant or the administration of CRRSAA funds. Next slide. Here's some resources for more information. We have some links in these slides, and the slides will be posted after the webinar on NADTC's website, so you can have these links. On the FTA website, we have frequently asked questions that had been there already with regard to the CARES Act, but they've all been updated to accommodate the CRRSAA information. We have the CRRSAA apportionment tables that I was referencing earlier for the Section 5310 program. There'll be, there's a recording of an FTA webinar that we did in January that was more broadly about CRRSAA funding. And of course, the 5310 circular is a great reference if you need to know anything at all about the 5310 program. There will be ultimately a CRRSAA apportionment notice published in the Federal Register. That hasn't happened yet, but once it does happen, that will be available on the FTA website as well. And this is the contact information for myself and Destiny in case it's needed for any follow-up. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. We'll be around for questions at the end after our other presenters.
Great. Thank you so much, Marianne and Destiny. And like she had said, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we will get to those at the end of the session. Now we will be sharing and hearing from two sub-recipients of FTA 5310 funding. And they are going to talk specifically about how they use 5310 funds for operations. And so first of all, Sheila, if you want to bring up your video and unmute yourself. Great, I will turn it over to you. Well, welcome Sheila Cuddy, Executive Director of the Quabog Valley Community Development Corporation. Thank you for being with us, Sheila.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Thank you for having me. And thank you very much, Marianne and Destiny. I've been taking copious notes while you were giving your presentation. So Quabog Valley CDC is a community development corporation in Massachusetts. We started in 1995 to provide loan capital to small businesses that couldn't access conventional financing. We quickly learned and grew to provide additional services to residents and our municipal partners in our region, because healthy communities create healthy workforces and make a better place for everyone to live and obtain their best possible lives. So we are, if you go to the next slide, please. So we are located in what we call West Central Massachusetts, an area, we serve an area of 15 to 20 towns in between Worcester and Springfield. It's a primarily rural region, and we learned when we started looking at barriers for employers to have a good solid workforce, that the lack of public transportation and even private transportation in our region was a critical barrier for the success of people getting to jobs, being able to maintain their jobs, and also getting to the other things that allowed them to have healthy lives, getting to educational resources, getting to medical appointments, getting to shopping, senior centers, and all of the vital things we need to get to in our day-to-day lives. We also looked at the cost of transportation for people to run a private vehicle in our region, and it was really exorbitant. And we identified this as, truly a difficult barrier for people to overcome and lead a good, solid lifestyle. When we started this service, we convened community partners and formed a Quabog Region Coordinating Council. With our community partners, we launched a demand response service in January of 2017. Our first month, we had 5 riders. Over the next couple of years, our rides grew to between 850 and 1,100 rides a month pre-COVID. COVID obviously created a big dent in our service. It's been a serious health issue in Massachusetts, as it is in many, many places. The challenges created by COVID have included increasing the safety measures on the vans, making sure the drivers and passengers could all be safe, reducing capacity on the vans, providing additional cleaning supplies, protective equipment, and a deep cleaning service a couple of times a week for the vans. We use the 5310 money with our partners in this service to pay our drivers, to cover some of the costs of our dispatch center, and fuel and the other maintenance, the other costs of providing a van service for residents of our region. With hearing about this additional funding to help offset the cost of COVID-19 on our service has been really, really helpful. The other things we're looking at is extra time for our dispatch center to rearrange rides because capacity in our vans was reduced due to safety measures for COVID-19. Having some increased outreach to our riders to make sure they understand what the reduced capacity means, what hours are available to them, and make sure that they're getting to the places they've needed to get to. We have found from our riders that there are some places they need to go to that hadn't previously been such a big concern. Many of our banks locally closed down and only offered drive-up service, and they really couldn't allow people for safety reasons to walk to the drive-up window. So the vans have been providing transportation to the drive-up window for riders so that they can get the cash that they need or transact their banking business. Other expenses we have found have included hiring some additional drivers and doing the outreach and advertising that is needed for that. We also, as a nonprofit partner in this, in terms of how does this work together with our public partners, QVCDC helps raise funds from other organizations and individuals in the region who want to support this important service. We have found that healthcare providers, employers, local foundations have been very generous supporters of this service, particularly as we've been able to demonstrate substantial need. You can see from this map that our demand response service currently encompasses 9 towns. We are in the planning process and about to launch a pilot to connect the region to more major centers of employment along Route 9. This has been a serious gap within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that there was no way to get from the Amherst, Northampton, Springfield area to Worcester directly on this Route 9 route. I am happy to answer any questions at the end of this presentation. I really appreciate your taking time to listen to me, and thank you again.
Great. Thank you very much, Sheila, for sharing how you're using 5310 for operating in your agency. Next, I'd like to welcome Jane Skinner, and she will be talking about their program, Get Up and Go Senior Transportation in Foster City, California. Thanks for joining us, Jane.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie, and the NADTC and the FTA for having us here to tell you more about our programs. As I am the Adult Programs and Get Up and Go Manager at the Peninsula Jewish Community Center, a nonprofit located in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our center offers a full range of programming, from preschool and after school programs to fitness and aquatics to Jewish life and adult lectures and classes. And finally, our Get Up and Go Senior Transportation Program. Get Up and Go is a free transportation program for adults age 50 and over who are living and traveling within San Mateo County. You can see on the slide here, the orange area is our coverage. So we cover all of the county except for the coast. And just to give you a little overview of our service, we provide air-end transportation service Monday through Friday. First pickup from the home around 9:30 and a final take home around 3:30. We have staff drivers who use minivans, one of which is a 5310 provided vehicle that has a manual ramp. And they also have access to small buses with wheelchair lifts. Intake is completed via telephone, primarily by a longtime volunteer, and there are no income, disability, membership, or other requirements. You just have to be 50 or over and need a ride. Riders only have to complete a waiver and return it, and then they can start calling in to make requests for rides. We typically have requests come in up to a month in advance for medical rides and other rides at least by the week prior, but with COVID and things changing all the time, we've gotten a little more nimble on our feet, able to schedule a few days in advance. We primarily provide service for life-sustaining activities, so to get to medical appointments, dental visits, physical therapy, dialysis, grocery shopping, the pharmacy, but we also strive to provide life-enhancing opportunities. Pre-COVID, we would give people rides to bridge classes, discussion groups, salon appointments, and we also had a group outing program for residents of assisted living and low-income senior housing, where we provided the bus and the driver, and then their activity director planned an outing. We take people on rides along the coast to have a picnic at a park or go to a local museum. And we look forward to being able to offer these services again when it's safe to do so. Get Up and Go has been operating for about 14 years, and through the expanded 5310 grants operational assistance, we have been able to expand. We were previously offering service 2 or 3 days a week, and now we're a full 5-day-a-week program. And prior to COVID, we also had a robust volunteer driver component that was really supported by the 5310 grant. We are in regular communication and are supported by San Mateo County's transit program, SamTrans. They see us as augmenting Ready Wheels, their paratransit program, by addressing the personalized assistant needs of older adults through our flexible, demand responsive transportation and through the arm-through-arm personal assistance we can provide. We're able to serve residents who live in areas that are not served by fixed route transit, and caregivers can accompany riders who need extra assistance at no charge. In fact, with 5310 funding, we were able to forego our highly subsidized fee of $6 round trip and now offer our errand service at no charge. As getting 5310 funds, we are a subrecipient of Caltrans as part of the Bay Area's large urbanized areas. And we're very lucky in that the local match in our area is covered by toll credits. We're able to use 5310 operational assistance to contribute to personnel for myself as the manager, our scheduler, our staff drivers. It also contributes to vehicle expenses such as fuel, maintenance, licenses, and insurance, and other expenses. We have a scheduling software that we use that is web-based, which is fantastic now that we're primarily working from home. 5310 operational assistance helps cover our drug and alcohol program for our drivers, volunteer relations when we're running that program, such as appreciation events and gas cards, as well as printing and marketing. Our program is also supported by other local grants from healthcare districts and foundations. And more immediately, we're supported by the center, by the PJCC, which provides for overhead expenses and coverage of any gaps in funding. Next slide. So as we all know, COVID-19 has had huge impacts. We had a full closure of our program from mid-March through April of last year. Beginning in May, we were taking some riders for non-emergency medical appointments. We would use our small buses so that the driver could be in the front, and we'd ask the rider to sit at the back of the bus. We also began partnering with our local Meals on Wheels provider to help them cover some routes to get meals to residents. Staff and volunteers also conducted well-check phone calls throughout this period to share community resources and provide a listening ear for our riders. In July, we began our new normal of rides for medical, dental, and physical therapy appointments for essential medical appointments plus grocery shopping. Then in the fall, we added in rides for flu shots and also appointments for tech repair or purchases, because we saw that really was an essential need as seniors who were sheltering in place needed a way to connect. And finally, in the last month, we've been able to start giving rides for COVID-19 vaccines. So as Sherry mentioned, we have also seen a huge decrease in our rides and ridership, well below our 5310 grant goals. As I mentioned, we've had to put our volunteer driver program and group outing programs on hold. We've also seen many cancellations in appointments that we're unable to fill in at the last minute, either because the rider has decided they don't feel comfortable getting out or that they can delay this appointment, and often because the doctor's offices themselves are postponing or moving appointments to telehealth. We are also, like Sherry mentioned, allowing additional time in our schedule for the scheduler to manage these changes, and also for the drivers to do a more thorough cleaning of the vehicle between each riders. Some unexpected expenses that have come up with COVID-19, we installed plexiglass partitions in all 3 of our minivans. So, kind of like riding in a taxi, our driver's in the front, there's a plexiglass screen, and the riders are in the back. We also regularly have to purchase PPE and cleaning supplies, and a smaller expense is just mailings that we would not have otherwise been sending to our riders to update them about our service and new policies and what we're able to do. And more globally, for our center has seen a huge loss in revenue because we are a nonprofit that is based on membership and program fees, and essentially most of our programs are not running. So it's been a huge impact. But we feel very lucky to be supported by 5310, and we're in regular communication with our 5310 liaison with Caltrans to update her on what we're able to do and to get ideas of what other transit providers are doing in our area. My information is here. I can also post it in the chat, but feel free to reach out if you have any specific questions about our program and how we use 5310 funds. I am open to answering questions as best I can. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. At this time, we are going to start our Q&A portion. I'd ask that all of the panelists to restart their videos so that we have you up for some of the questions. I did respond to some of the questions in the Q&A box that were very specific to the programmatic aspects of both Jane and Sheila's program, and the PowerPoint and materials will be made available, and I encourage you to reach out directly to them, as we will not be getting into the programmatic details in this webinar. We had them come on here and talk about different ways that you can use 5310 for operating if that is not being done in your community at this point. And so we'll have you reach out to them directly if you have questions specific to the details of their program. So first of all, we had some questions about who to contact for applying for Crisa funding. And with that, some of these being subrecipients weren't sure what UZA stands for. So Marianne, can you talk a little bit about the process that some of these subrecipients would have to go through to find out about this funding?
Sure. And I apologize for the jargony acronym. Sometimes we forget that we're sort of talking in code. So UZA, for anyone who doesn't know, is just an abbreviation that we use for the term urbanized area. So the way, just broadly for people that are new to this topic, the way Section 5310 and some other Federal Transit Administration funding works, it's allocated. I use the word apportioned in the during the PowerPoint, but basically the funds are allocated from FTA by either for states, if the for states, for services that are, the states receive the funds or get the funds allocated to them for services that would be operated in rural areas or in small urbanized areas. And then for large urbanized areas, there's an allocation directly to the urbanized area. And for within the Section 5310 program, the governor of each state has designated a direct recipient, a designated recipient for each urbanized area in that state. So those designated recipients in large urbanized areas are the entities that are using that are deciding how the 5310 funds will be used within their urbanized within each large urbanized area. And for rural areas and small urbanized areas, it's the state, most often the State Department of Transportation, that is making those decisions. So if you're not one of those, and you would know if you are, if you're not a designated recipient and you're not a state, then you are most likely a subrecipient. And so for you, or you're a potential subrecipient of Section 5310 funds. And so for you, what you need to do if you're interested in receiving 5310 funds is become familiar with the process that the designated recipient or the state uses to distribute the funding. And that's done. Every designated recipient and every state has a program management plan, or if it's a state, we call it a state management plan that describes their process. For the regular 5310 funds, they usually undergo whatever that process is they have discretion to do it however they want. I think most of them usually have some kind of process that they go through about once a year to figure out what the needs are in their area and try to, make funding decisions. Now, the CRRSAA funds came along, they're extra funds sort of outside of that annual process. So the designated recipients and the states are probably right now figuring out what they're going to do with the funds that have been allocated to them under CRRSAA. And so if the only thing that I can say is if you've been in the program, then you probably know what entity it was that gave you your funds, and you probably should be contacting that entity to find out if there are CRRSAA funds available for some need that you have, or how they're going to make them available. So, and if you've never received 5310's funding before, you're going to need to figure out who that designated recipient is. And you could, I guess my best suggestion would be with a specific question. If you don't know that answer, or you don't know how to figure it out, contact NADTC or FTA, and we will try to get you to that on an individual basis.
Thank you,
I hope that,
Yeah.
is that a good explanation? Okay.
Yes, and just to clarify, so if there are people on this webinar who are not current recipients, but qualify as eligible under the guidelines, they could potentially get CRRSAA funds if their designated recipient allows that.
Correct. They would be eligible. However, I will emphasize that it is really the designated recipient that is in control of how those funds are used within their area. So there's no guarantees. I cannot guarantee that they would, but they would be eligible if they, yeah. So
Right.
so they just need to, you just need to work with the designated recipient for your area.
Excellent. And a question for Jane and Sheila, for the grant program that you're working under, who is your grantee? Is it the state DOT or is it a metropolitan area? And how long have you received those funds, 5310 funds?
Well, I'll jump in. Thank you. We go through the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, so the state gets the funds directly. And we have been using 5310 money since 2018. The first year of our program, we had a different source of funding.
Thank you. And Jane?
We are also through the state, through Caltrans. And we have been getting, we applied and were accepted for the third round of 5310 funds. So I'm thinking our first round was probably 2015. Basically, we got new freedom funds. And then when that program ended and things shifted and 5310 had expanded funds, we were able to apply.
Great, thank you. So here's a question. Are tribes able to receive funding directly, or must they go through the state as a sub-recipient?
There are, I believe, it's the same as if they weren't a tribe. So if they are a designated recipient, which is possible, then they could be receiving funding directly. Also, I believe that tribes, even when they have been allocated funding by a state, they do have an option to work with FTA directly on the administration of those funds. So I'm not, if that's where the question is coming from, that is a possibility. It can, there are different variations on that question, depending on the tribe and the situation.
Okay, thank you. And feel free to put another question in if you have another question related to that.
Yeah.
So there was a question here. CARES Act funding is different, and CARES Act funding did not provide any funding, additional funding for 5310, but there are specific requirements to CARES Act of percentages that can be used and applied for. Does any of that translate over to CRRSAA funds? So if somebody's allocating CRRSAA funds, do they need to necessarily worry about how much CARES funds have been allocated to that agency or anything like that?
Not, I'm going to say it doesn't it doesn't impact, since today we're talking about 5310. So there was no 5310 funding in the CARES Act. The 5310 allocation within Crisa is sort of independent, I guess, would be the easiest way to conceive of it. So if you're a direct recipient, or maybe a state is asking this question, I don't think you need to worry about anything to do with the CARES Act percentages with regard to the 5310 Crisa funds.
Mhm. And any questions about the 5307, 5311 funds and the CARES Act and how those interact, where would they direct those questions?
Oh, I would suggest that you ask those. I don't want to spend our time in this webinar on that.
Right.
So I would ask those questions of your FTA regional office, and then if they need to, they'll consult with headquarters on the answers.
Okay. So there was question here about when we can start to apply for these funds. And I think you had said that it's up to the direct recipient. They will put the timeline out there. Is there an expiration date for the funds that they have to Crisa?
The answer to that is no. When we at FTA think about expiration dates, we talk about the funds lapsing, so they have to be obligated. Normally, they have to be obligated within a certain time period, but Crisa does not have that. But we and Congress were aware that there's a great need because of COVID-19 to get funds out as quickly as possible. So of course, we're encouraging the recipients to use the funds as expeditiously as possible.
Right. There were a couple questions. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have something to add?
No, I'm just saying, but they won't expire, but we want you to use them as fast as you can.
Right. Okay. So there was a question. You had said that unobligated 5310 funds can be used at 100%. That was in the slideshow. And somebody asked, can those funds be dated back to January 2020?
I think I'm gonna defer that question because I don't want to say anything incorrect. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head.
Okay.
So check with if you're a direct grantee and you're thinking about doing that, just check with the regional office first.
Okay.
I think the answer is yes, but I don't.
Right.
Maybe that's wrong.
It would be a good thing to check, but as you had said,
Yeah.
Unobligated funds can be granted at the 100%.
That part is for sure. Yes.
Yeah. Do Sheila or Jane, do you happen to know if Caltrans or MassDOT has publicly disclosed the process for getting 5310 Crisa funds out to subrecipients yet?
So Caltrans, our 5310 liaison, did reach out to us, and I think at least everyone in our urbanized area, they had us submit a survey to let them know if we were interested in the funds and kind of what we had seen as an impact of COVID-19. We have not heard back yet about that. I know that they are trying to figure out how to best allocate the funds that they have.
Great, thank you. And Sheila, we had Massachusetts DOT on our webinar on Tuesday, and Jennifer talked a little bit about it, but as a subrecipient, have you heard anything official yet?
Have not heard anything official. Thank you for asking, but we work closely with Jenna, so I'm sure we will.
Yes, and she did say that they are looking to prioritize nonprofits for when they're allocating their funding. So her portion is of in the Tuesday webinar. She did talk a little bit about that, although it's not finalized, but that was their hope, was to prioritize the nonprofits. Let me see here. So if there were a 5310 applicant who has only received funding for vehicles in the past, could they be eligible for the Crisa funds to use that for operating?
Yes, anyone is eligible, but again, according to whatever process the direct recipient determines that they're going to use. So that was interesting to hear from Jane that, you know, they've been asked already what their needs are. So probably many direct recipients are trying to feel it out and figure out how they can best, you know, the funds can be put where they're needed most.
And from the FTA's perspective, is there a timeline that states have to determine how they're going to allocate the CRRSAA funding?
No, there's no specific timeline, but again, it just goes back to, you know, hopefully we're trying to at least get out of the way as much as we can, so that the funds can be allocated and put to use as quickly as possible. But these things do sometimes take a little bit of time.
Sure. So here's a question: if these funds can be used to stand up a COVID-19 vaccination transportation program?
We have already there's a frequently asked question on the FTA website in the COVID-19 section that talks about how Section 5310 funds, as well as other FTA funds, can be used regarding the distribution of vaccines. It does have to be. Can you tell me the question again? Was it about building a vaccine site?
No, to build a program, a transportation program to get to people.
Transportation, right? That's okay. I misheard. So yeah, if it's transportation, so look at the frequently asked question on the FTA site. Maybe that will answer the question in detail. And then, of course, any other questions about, you know, very specific eligibilities should be asked through the FTA regional office or your direct recipient.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit about, you know, if it is somebody who has not received 5310 before, how do they need to be listed in the Coordinated Human Services Transportation Plan?
Yes, so every state and region has a Coordinated Human Services Transportation Plan, and maybe some of our sub-recipients could also speak to this, how it works in their area. But any 5310, it's really about the project. Any 5310 project needs to be included in a coordinated public transit coordinated human services public transit coordination plan. And what that is a plan for that the area has developed with participation from the public and from the human services agencies that are providing these types of services, that's sort of prioritizing what the needs are for transportation for people with disabilities and older adults that's funded under Section 5310. So again, if you've never received 5310 funding before, probably the first thing you want to do is find out what the process is to get included in that plan and to have your project or your idea included.
Okay, thank you. And
I don't know if Jane or Sheila want to talk about that aspect of what they do at all.
yeah, please, Sheila and Jane, if you can mention a little bit about how that coordination process, planning process happens in your area.
Sorry about that. When I mentioned that we started our service in 2017, there were 10 years previous to 2017 where work was done with many community partners, including the state. And in Massachusetts, that would be the Executive Office of Housing and Human Services. Mass Mobility falls under that umbrella, and the Department of Transportation. So we had those folks at the table with us when we were building our plan for the service.
Thank you.
And in our area, it's the MTA, and we've worked closely with someone there, the Municipal Transportation Association agency. With Drennan, we worked with her closely when we got New Freedom funds, so we were already part of we were lucky that our program was already part of the coordinated plan for our area. And we just regularly, if we have any changes or updates, we communicate those with our contact there.
Great, thank you. Marianne, is there anything that tribes specifically need to know about the CRRSAA funding? I know you had mentioned that they could be sub-recipients, they could be direct. Is there anything else about the CRRSAA funding that would be relevant to tribes?
Well, in general, all of the requirements and provisions that we talked about would apply to tribes receiving 5310 funding just the same as they apply to everybody else. So there's nothing really unique or specific to tribes about this particular funding. Again, they would need to, in most cases, I think tribes are going to be sub-recipients, and so would be working with the direct recipient, would be included in the coordinated plan that we've just been talking about, and things like that. So
Great, thank you. If a direct recipient typically uses a call for projects or an RFP or application project for regular 5310 programs, do they have to use the exact same process for CRRSAA funding, for allocating CRRSAA funding?
no, they don't have to use the exact same process. That was, as I mentioned, that those processes should be all described very well in a program management plan. And so if they, in order to really expedite the use of CRRSAA funding as much as we could, that was one of the things that we just have said, that if there's some deviation from their normal process that they need to undertake, as long as they document what that is and work with the FTA regional office, they can do something slightly different. If that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. So there was a question related to the CRRSAA 5310 funds. You had mentioned that they can be used for PPE and some of those expenses, but do all activities related to CRRSAA funding have to be related to COVID relief?
No, they don't have to be related to COVID relief. They do have to just meet the eligibilities under the Section 5310 program. So they have to be serving people with disabilities and older adults primarily. That would be the main thing.
All right.
But they don't have to be specific to COVID.
And in terms of for the regular, there were some questions related to COVID expenses with the regular 5310 funding they receive. Would that be a question they would need to pose to their direct recipient if those are eligible expenses?
But that's a good idea. Yeah, ask the direct recipient. In general, it's the same as what I said earlier. If it's an operating expense, it should be for something that has a useful life of less than 1 year. That's sort of a good rule of thumb for an operating expense. If you have questions about capital under other, non-CRRSAA 5310 grants, I would say direct those questions to the direct recipient. And if you're a direct recipient needing the answer, ask the FTA regional office.
Great, thank you. So one of the requirements with CRRSAA funding that was not in any of the other relief funding was the requirement to certify that no employees were furloughed if they want to use the funding for anything aside from operating. Can you just let us know where they could find information about that specifically?
Yes, we're aware. We have received many questions at FTA about that provision. That's a new provision with CRRSAA, not only for 5310, but also for the other FTA funding sources. And we are still working on the details of really understanding all of the details about how to implement that. So we will hopefully fairly soon, eventually, when we know all the answers, they will be posted with the other frequently asked questions on the FTA website about COVID-19. So I would just say you'll have to have a little bit of patience, and we're working on that as quickly as we can, and they'll be posted there when we have the answers.
Great, thank you. Let me read through a couple questions here as they keep coming in. So some of these questions relate directly to how they're going to report the expenses, say if they backdate to January 20 of 2020, and how do they report that, and how do they report their CRRSAA expenses versus their regular 5310 expenses. Can you provide some information or where they should be going for those specific questions?
That again, if they're assuming they're subrecipients, they need to work with the direct recipient, the designated or direct recipient that they're working with. And if you are a direct recipient, again, CFTA regional office will help you with that. But I suspect that questions coming from subrecipients. So
Great.
the direct recipient will know, yeah, how they want to see that information.
Okay, thank you. Another question, someone was looking at the apportionment tables and they said they don't see the agency they normally work with for 5310 on the FTA apportionment table. Does that mean that there's no funding available for them?
No, not necessarily. The apportionment table lists the funding by state and urbanized area, not by recipient. So that's the way we do it every year for the regular Section 5310 funding. So the direct and designated recipients in each urbanized area will be working together. If there's more than one per urbanized area, they'll be working together to determine how much funding each of them get. And that was the reference that I made earlier in the presentation to a split letter is about that process. And once they know that information, then they'll be, as we've been talking about all along, then the direct recipients will be allocating it to their subrecipients. So if you've been working with someone in the past, just like Jane and I forgot your name, your other speaker, Sheila, it disappeared off my screen. Sorry. Just contact that direct recipient that you've worked with in the past and let them know you're interested. And I'm sure most likely they'll be contacting you soon if they haven't already.
Great. Well, thank you so much. If we did not answer your question and you have a specific question, my email address is here and I can refer you on if that needs to go on to somebody else. Some specific questions can be sent to Jane and Sheila if you have questions about their particular programs. We thank you all for joining us today. And the materials will all be posted on the NADTC website. The recording, the transcript, and the PowerPoints will all be there probably by tomorrow afternoon. So you're welcome to download those and look at those there. And we really appreciate you joining us for this webinar today. And we wish you a great day. And this ends our webinar for the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Good job.